concluded that first homes are inappropriate for meeting housing need, given the overall constraint of the London Plan, £90,000 per household income threshold for eligibility for intermediate housing.
In terms of viability, potentially more viable.
Yes, I mean there are a number of balancing factors. So the amount, the value of first homes will be slightly higher than shared ownership, but balancing against that is that typically one would expect the developer themselves to deliver the first homes. They would apply a higher profit margin to those than would be the case for traditional affordable, because they are inherently riskier, because they're like market housing, they're being sold to individual purchasers, not to an RP, and there would also be marketing costs applied to those as well. So on balance, it's probably broadly the same in terms of viability outcomes, but that will vary across the plan period depending on what happens to sales values. So it could be that if values increase, there will be a varying impact that is difficult to predict at this point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I think we did discuss this, but on a practical level, we are getting no requests to deliver this product. It's not a product that developers appear to be interested in.
And in terms of the requirement for affordable housing on smaller sites, what impact does that have in terms of the viability of those smaller schemes?
We've tested a number of smaller sites. So these are typology numbers 1, 2, 3, 8 and 9. And looking at any of the tables from 6.12.1 onwards, with the varying sales values across the borough, you see that all of those sites remain green up to 50% affordable housing. So although we've tested them with on-site affordable housing delivered, or that's the underlying assumption, in practical terms, it would be a payment in lieu for the affordable housing based on an equivalent amount of providing the relevant affordable housing level on site for practical reasons. You clearly can't provide affordable housing on a 5-unit scheme because RPs won't be interested in doing that. And you then have issues around second cause and so on. But in terms of viability, those smaller sites are no less viable than the other sites that we've tested. So they can readily contribute towards wider need through a payment in lieu, and that would be used on other sites to enhance the affordable housing level that they can deliver through some form of grant funding or for use on council's own land for bringing forward council housing.
Thank you. Obviously, I'd ask the council to do a note in terms of the justification for the affordable housing on small sites, and obviously the viability, sort of results will feed into that. Just as a general point, the tables obviously reflect different land values in different parts of the borough, as has been mentioned. Is there somewhere in the study that kind of reflects that? So if I'm looking at a particular table, can I correlate that with land values?
Yeah. So if you when looking at the tables, if you have a look at page 11 of the document, this plots out, and rather unhelpfully, it's done in square feet. So I'll have to apologise for this, but we've got two different ways of measuring values. So we've got square foot values in the map on page 11, which gives you an indication of different value areas across the borough. And then going back to the tables at 612 onwards, they all relate to different sales values. So 612.1, for example, this is where the slight inconsistency creeps in. We've got values of 6845 a square metre, so divide by 10.764. Mental note for myself not to do values in two different ways. 636 a square foot. So you can see then if we go back to the map, that would broadly align with values in sort of the southeast of the borough, Grove Park, and then you can see that other parts of the borough values tend to increase as you go west and you go north. So the highest values, so that would relate to the later tables in that range of 612.1 to 612.9 would be in the north of the borough, lower values in the southeast of the borough.
I feel an action point coming on here. I can't help myself. Just being a little bit lazy. Would it be possible just to do like an addendum which just shows the correlation between the land values in the tables to the sort of broad areas in terms of square meters as opposed to square feet?
Absolutely, yes.
Hopefully that's not too time consuming.
No.
Yes.
Sorry, just touching on a point I made earlier, which is when you're simply looking at the square feet or meterage values, they need to be referenced to the capital values as well, not just the pure areas. The reason is because a number of the databases, such as Molly or others, take the net sales area of a unit rather than the actual net internal area. So you get a differential of rates per square meter, which aren't reflected in the capital values. So an error creeps in. So it would also be important to have the indicative capital values for these units, as well as just the square feet or meterage numbers.
I think that's going beyond what I asked for.
Yeah, it does somewhat, and I'm not clear on the point because Molio reports the net internal area based on the EPC certificate. So I'm not sure why there would be a difference between net saleable and net internal area. Sorry, I meant to address the questions through you, Mom.
Sorry, well,
I think I just wanted to get a feel for how the tables in terms of the relevant sales land values related to different geographical areas. So it was a fairly simple request. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm just going to keep ploughing through. Build for rent schemes. What was the outcome of the appraisals?
Yeah, so build to rent schemes, they have slightly different economics. Obviously, it's not being sold to individual people, it's being sold to an investor. What we find on the ground, notwithstanding what we find in the assessment, is that broadly speaking, the economics are fairly similar to build for sale schemes. So the investor will pay a slightly discounted price for the completed units, but they will pay earlier, so they'll often pay on a forward fund basis, so they'll basically fund the developer to build them, and that has a slightly better cash flow impact than the build for sale scheme. So broadly speaking, you end up balancing out a slightly discounted value against the finance savings. So build to rent schemes can broadly accommodate the policy requirements in the same way as build for sale, but there is variability as indicated by the assessment, in the same way there's variability based on type of scheme and benchmark land value as would apply to build for sale schemes. So they like build for sale schemes will have to potentially apply the viability tested route when they need to unless they can meet the 35%.
Have been many build for rent schemes in the borough?
There are certainly build-to-rent schemes coming in the borough, and build-to-rent schemes proposed in the advanced pre-application stage and the application stage. I'm trying to think. I think there is. We can come back to you on if we've got any build. I think Lewisham Gateway has a build to rent scheme as well. I'm looking and getting some nods from Land Securities there. Who, yes, so we definitely do have build to rent schemes that are built and are coming as well.
It was just out of interest, really. Okay, moving on to specialist housing for older persons. Just if you can broadly say what the outcome of the assessment was, but also you'll be aware of the representation in terms of the fact that the study said we have tested specialist housing for older people, brackets C3 use class. But the representation suggests that that hasn't actually been followed through in the study. So if you could pick that up, please.
Yeah, this arises from the assessment of the nature of specialist housing for older people, and in particular McCarthy and Stone type developments. And our conclusion was that you have a slightly higher gross area versus net area. So in comparison to a standard residential scheme, you've got slightly more gross space than you would normally have. But to compensate for that, you will typically achieve higher sales values or premium sales values on a retirement scheme. And this is evidenced through live schemes that we've seen. So the two factors balance each other out. So broadly speaking, the economics of a specialist housing scheme of the type built by McCarthy and Stone is broadly similar to that of a standard residential development. So when the affordable housing requirement, which is obviously in the London plan, so it's not a local plan policy, but the London plan policy is applied on the ground, it's found to be as viable as any other residential development would be. The difference being that typically it's dealt with through a payment in lieu rather than through on-site affordable because of the nature of the occupiers.
So has it specifically been tested, the sort of old person's housing, which would fall within the C3 category?
Not explicitly, but as I said, the economics are the same with those two factors taken into account.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that it's not specifically addressed in the study, and the point that obviously it's a whole plan viability study, and older persons housing schemes falling within C3 category would form part of development coming forward in the borough, and it doesn't appear to have been specifically tested. So I hear what you're saying, but that's not necessarily set out in the evidence base.
We can certainly look at that and do a discrete piece of work which just assesses on a typological basis that particular typology, if that would be helpful.
I think it would be helpful to set that out and possibly an addendum. So to create an additional action point. But from what you were saying, it wouldn't necessarily be an issue in terms of the viability of such schemes.
No, whenever we've tested these on a live basis in London, they are as viable as any other development. Sorry, before we move off this point, I'll just clarify that although we've not tested a C3 older person's home, we have tested a residential care home, which could be analogous to an older person's housing scheme, although for a slightly higher level of care. So it would be an older person's scheme plus really, and that shows as being viable in the assessment. But we're entirely happy, as you've suggested, that we test a McCarthy and Stone type scheme as an addendum. But just to say that a slightly enhanced scheme is already in the assessment, which is the reference in the conclusion to C3 older person scheme being viable.
But obviously that type of scheme would be more C2 than C3, and I think that's the point, isn't it? Yeah. I was just checking my notes. I seem to recall in the representations reference to the London Plan EIP report and the suggestion that in sort of certain areas, Lewisham being potentially one of those, with lower land values, there could be an issue in terms of viability. Is that something you could address?
Sorry, in reference to which particular use?
Specialist housing. It was in the McCarthy and Stone representation, and they cross-referenced to the London Plan EIP, the examiner's report. And I think that was paragraph 222 of their report.
I'll have to come back to you on that point. I can't. I need to look at what was said in that report and the reasons underlying the conclusion. I can address that point with the testing, if that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's just worth making the point that obviously the kind of lower land values towards the south of the borough, I would argue that there's less opportunity for the type of development that McCarthy and Stone are seeking, simply because there's less developable land within that area. But nevertheless, we can pick that up in the addendum and address that point.
And, looking at the study as a whole, were there any particular site typologies which would struggle, in your view, with viability?
There's a degree of variability. So in very broad terms, the outcome will relate to the benchmark land value of a particular site and the quantum of development that site can accommodate. And you will see in the assessment that there's a broad range of outcomes depending on how those two factors interact. But it tends to be the very large development typologies that are slightly more difficult to bring forward than the smaller ones. So it's the scale of development and cash flow and the fact you're building a scheme over a 10 to 15 year period. It makes it slightly more difficult than a smaller scheme built over 2 years or even a shorter period of time.
Okay, thank you. So overall, taking into account the cumulative scale of SIL obligations and policy requirements, is the plan deliverable? I do apologise, I missed you there.
No problem. Obviously, I'll just reiterate the point in relation to trading supermarkets in terms of typology of sites coming forward and the challenges related to that.
Okay, thank you. So just in terms of summing up, overall, is the plan deliverable?
Yeah, so what the study indicates is that having regard to the policy backdrop in London Plan Policy H5 that sets a fast-track route for 35% and a viability tested route for other schemes, the different affordable housing levels with regard to that backdrop and having regard to the significant array of types of site that will come forward in Lewisham, from 1 unit up to several thousand units and everything in between, with varying benchmark land values across the borough. The policies are viable and therefore the scale of housing in the plan is deliverable over the plan period.
Is it a brief point?
Ma'am, I have to reference back to Conington Road site in relation to the deliverability as it stands with the constraints that are being proposed in relation to that site, that it is challenging to make it deliverable given the numbers, given the assessments that we've made, which are all in the statement. And there needs to be some recognition of that. There are some other points which I'd just like to touch on, if I may. One of the points that was referenced on matter 17, and I don't want to reiterate and go over old ground, but we weren't able to address this on the day, but in relation to the pushing back of the development into the 6 to 11 year period, just as a passing point, the central Lewisham area is bearing 96% of the units being pushed back into the 6 to 11 year bracket out of the 1,700 odd units which are proposed to be delivered in the following 5-year period. 96% of them fall within the central Lewisham area. I don't know whether that's in relation to the protection of the delivery of certain sites, including that of land securities, but land securities themselves indicate in their annual report, 2024 annual report, that they're unlikely to start delivery before 2026, which implies, based on their own timeframes, that they're not going to deliver units until 2030, which puts those particular units back into the 6 to 11 year bracket. I think there's an implication in terms of the deliverability of the plan in that context. We've made the points in relation to the sustainability of the site and its least or lack of sensitivity in relation to building heights. And again, we'd reiterate the point in terms of the capping of 16 stories. This is a site that's been brought forward or attempted to be brought forward by 2 other developers prior to 2020, so in 2019. There were pre-app discussions at the time with the council to demonstrate what was required to bring it forward, and they've been curtailed. I know these are site-specific issues, Ma'am, and I apologise for having to go over them again.
I was just wondering, were those issues raised in your original reps? I want to stray too far from those.
They were referenced during the Matter 17 hearing, Ma'am. But we're responding to changes that were occurring at the time.
Landsec?
2 very brief points. One, just to confirm, the first completions for Lewisham Shopping Centre are 2028, 29, and that's in the trajectory that I saw this morning. And secondly, just to say, I have the Matter 17 legal point that you referred to at the start in front of me, if you do want to cover that.
Is it a point in relation to the issue raised by Boyer? I'll take that first if it is.
It is, yes, yes. Just that, obviously the council's fairly surprised by the criticism of the viability assessment and the attempt to essentially derail the plan, considering we have had conversations with the Stair Living through the plan process. We have got a Regulation 19 response from Stair Living, which does not bring up any of these points. So I just want to put on record the council's surprise at some of these points, specifically to do with the plan and specifically to do with the viability assessment, which again haven't been raised in the past with the council.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, in relation to the legal opinion, I just wonder if you could just introduce it, and I'll give the council the opportunity to give an opinion as to whether they're happy to accept it.
Yep. So I think the suggestion was made in the Matter 17 session that the Lewisham House proposals by Lewisham House number 1 be deliverable without any third-party consents, whereas those by Landsec would require third-party consents, and that was sort of I suppose, a benefit of one proposal over another. Landsec have checked with their legal advisors, and I won't go through every detail, but essentially the Lewisham House number 1 proposal would require approval of Landsec and access rights, primarily in relation to construction works. So that proposal wouldn't be deliverable without third-party approvals. Really, just to correct the point that was made. Happy to sort of give that in writing or legally if required.
When you say legal opinion, how long is it?
It is 2 pages. I mean, sorry, 3 pages. Perhaps opinion is the wrong word. I think it's just a factual note as to what the land ownership and access right situation is, and construction works are within that, which they're not.
And I am reluctant to get into legal matters. And if that opinion is submitted, obviously Lewisham House would need a right to respond. I think the only way it is really relevant is in terms of deliverability, the deliverability of the sites. Can I just ask the council's view whether they would be happy to accept that into the examination?
I think the council would be happy if it's going to aid the inspectors in terms of the conversation that we had on the matter of deliverability. We're obviously slightly nervous about opening up a kind of backwards and forwards, toing and froing between parties, but clearly if it's a kind of factual position in terms of the kind of lease agreements, then it could be helpful. But again, I think the council will be guided by the inspectors on this one.
I'm guessing Lewisham House may have a different legal opinion on it, which may be submitted or not.
Potentially, I don't know. I mean, I think the conclusion from our perspective is that sort of either approach to development would require approval of one or other party, and therefore they're in a similar situation.
I think the point that we raised, the council raised at the time, was that obviously we've been having negotiations or through the pre-application process with land securities, and we have been made aware of this legal opinion, and that there has been no response from Lewisham House in terms of that legal opinion. So it does question the deliverability of that coming forward by the leaseholder. But again, I guess the council's slightly nervous of getting into a toing and froing between lawyers, actually, between what the leasehold agreement says. But again, if it's going to be helpful, the council is happy for it to be submitted.
Okay, thank you. I thought it was useful just to hear what the, in broad terms, what that said, and also to seek the council's view on it being submitted. But I think we'll take that away and have a think about it. Okay, sorry to keep you behind past 5:30. That concludes my questions in relation to the viability assessment. We are due to meet at 9:30 tomorrow. Just to confirm, are we back upstairs in the usual place? Okay, we shall adjourn till then. Thank you.